great panel presented on from an educational perspective. The name of the panel is Building the Cyber Workforce Industry Perspective. And it makes me think about, I believe it was Admiral Rogers when he came aboard as the lead of Cybercom. He kept speaking, often spoke about cyber as a team sport. And we've heard it talking about in a lot of our presentations, a multidisciplinary approach to education for cyber and the kind of insights required to bring not just technical competence, but overall operational competence required multiple insights. And it's only natural for AFCEA to bring aboard an industry panel. We appreciate, relish, frankly, our relationship with industry and our ability to offer them opportunities for interface with government and interface with academia. Kind of the whole premise of this event built around what I think I thought was very, very interesting that Mr. Quinn pointed out in our last panel, that AFCEA has this association role in this space. We're very comfortable to be, frankly, learning our way into it with your help and assistance in this event. And it wouldn't be right if we didn't offer industry an opportunity to speak about cyber training, and the cyber workforce. So we've assembled a great panel to do that today, expertise and experience in the cyber field, in industry as it relates to cyber development. And I think it will be another chapter that we turn here towards building an understanding of education and training for the cyber mission. We've got a team of 5 with a great moderator, an old friend of mine, Tom Davis, is our moderator. Tom, a field artillery officer like me, served in the Army, served with distinction, and went on to industry. It was interesting. He found his way into the PA&E side of the Defense Department, where he learned everything there is to learn about the interface between industry and the military mission when it came down to the money, but came down to the mission as well. Tom went on to industry with great insight he provided to industry as a strategic planner. But as well, he's been just a good friend, mentor in a variety of ways for me in this relationship of industry as it relates to today's defense requirements. He is a senior fellow and industry chair at the DAU, Defense Acquisition University. He's an author, I'll let him push his book, author of a great book, writing another one. He's the Renaissance man of our class. We are awfully glad to have him as our moderator. I'd like you to please help me welcome Tom and his panel to the forum. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I appreciate that exaggeration, as always. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me just thank AFCEA for putting an event like this together. One of the comments that I often make to the classes that I lecture at DAU is that we're in a period right now where it's increasingly difficult, as I saw during my 16 years in industry, for the industry to actually talk to the governmental defense customer. It's difficult to do that in a way that's proper, casual, continuous, and it's forums like this that really substitute for the difficulty that we have in other places. So to Bob Shea and Bob Wood and your whole AFCEA team, thanks for doing that. And looking around the room, it's great to see so many old, familiar faces. I think all of us agree we're old, and I'm trying to figure out why many of you are familiar. But it's great to have that chance to get together again and enjoy some time together. I'm sorry General Morrison left. I noticed he'd made a comment about somebody in the back on a haircut, and I think when Bob Wood and I were young lieutenants in the Army, we had a hell of a time getting soldiers to cut their hair, and now they have a hell of a time getting them to grow any. So things evolve and things change as you go by. One of the actual Renaissance men and distinguished individuals in the class from the military academy Bob and I were privileged to graduate from is a classmate of mine named Andy Krepinevich. He's actually better known commonly as Dr. Krepinevich. He is arguably, but I think most of us could make a good argument, one of the most respected and best known strategic thinkers that exist in the country today. Pretty much anything Andy writes and anything Andy says is pretty quickly translated into Chinese and becomes mandatory reading in the PRC, Ministry of Defense, and in the People's Liberation Army. He wrote a report in 2012, which was entitled Cyber Warfare, a Nuclear Option. And when he said nuclear option, he meant this is a very serious thing that is going to be substituting for the way that conflict and combat and other ways that nations interact is going to be happening in the future. He said in the report that the report was intended to explore the question of whether we are on the cusp of a major shift in the character of warfare as military competition expands into the cyber domain. And I think here we are in 2018, we're probably reasonably comfortable to reach the conclusion that we've passed that cusp. We're definitely in that. Andy and I were having lunch one time, and he made the comment that it could have been many years ago where a hostile power landed 1 million soldier force on America's shores, and they fanned out, they stole our property, they threatened our means of communications, they began to threaten our key infrastructure. They would be like something that the nation would rise up against with a very strong voice. But we've got a situation now where you have essentially 1 million invisible soldiers spreading out across the country doing this, and the impacts are much less obvious. I was thinking about that, and if this will work like it's supposed to. There we go. I was thinking about that, and when it comes to invisible soldiers, the Army is actually doing pretty well. As evidenced by the Army-Navy game last December, where, and for those of you out there in the BDUs or ACUs and so forth, look, I see you, but the Army football team, showed up in these white uniforms. So I think they're picking up on the idea of dealing with invisible soldiers, probably in a context that Andy never had in mind. Didn't do that for you, Bill. Yeah. It was just something there. Let me talk about DAU for just a second, though, but to match what's going on in this new emerging environment that we're in right now, the Defense Acquisition University is making an effort to try to put together several cybersecurity initiatives and to deal with the threat and the problem of cybersecurity as it pertains to governmental programs. We make an effort at DAU, they make an effort, I'm just kind of an adjunct there. In curriculum development, the courses that they teach about cybersecurity and cybersecurity workshops that they have quite frequently. The faculty there will do consulting, both with government agencies and with the private sector, and strategic planning. What should you think about going forward? It's a whole new area for them, but we've put a lot of resources at it that I think are beginning to show some results. There are several courses that have been developed and are being developed involving cybersecurity and a cybersecurity curriculum. These are basically starting at the 200 level course and higher and lower. There's a cybersecurity component to the program manager's course, which is the highest level course at DAU, a 400 level course. It is organized like a university with 100 through 400 level courses. And I didn't even know this until I started working with the DAU staff and faculty a couple years ago. They're actually distributed across the country. I always thought DAU was at Fort Belvoir in this one little quadrangle built around Building 206. But actually there are other campuses around the country. One in Huntsville, Alabama, which is co-located with the Army Materiel Command. It has something of an Army focus. There's one in San Diego, works a lot with SPAWAR, a bit of a Navy focus. Kettering, Ohio, right outside of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where you have a campus there that works very much with the Air Force, and then a couple of smaller campuses up the East Coast, Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and so forth. So you have access to DAU facilities where these courses are taught and the curriculum is developed, and a faculty exists that for those of you in industry and representing that, and those of you in the government sector who need to get people to these classes and courses or want to, that's probably a little bit closer and more convenient to you than you might expect. Down at the bottom you see Steve Mills. Is Steve in here? Steve's there in the back in the left corner. He works on the cybersecurity curriculum at the DAU South Campus in Huntsville, Alabama. If any of you want to talk to Steve afterwards, please feel free to do so, and I'm sure he can give you a very full rundown on what's going on with that. But along those lines, one of the things that's happened at DAU, for those of you who are industry customers, is the participation in DAU courses by industry people has dropped dramatically since 2010. We've gone from, I put the big numbers down there, you can see the yellow line. That is a trend for those of you that are into program analysis. 24,000 student participants from industry in the DAU curriculum last year, down to 8,000. A rather dramatic drop. I think there's a lot of reasons associated with that. some of them having to do with the Budget Control Act, sequestration, the fact that the industry across the board has lowered its cost curve, and a lot of that means fewer people doing more things and less time to do things like attend courses such as the ones that are being offered. But I think it's important that for those of you that have the need for cybersecurity and other things, to do what you can to make the time. Because among other things, sending someone to one of these courses gives you an opportunity to meet people in the government on the customer side who may be important people to know later on, and it's an opportunity to interface with customers on an intimate basis that you won't normally get elsewhere. I've got a great panel here, but before I introduce them, I wanted to just mention one thing about my observations in the industry. As Bob mentioned, I was Vice President for Strategic Planning for General Dynamics for many years, and one of the things that I learned there was that when you're the strategic planner, your job is basically to look at an emerging market, and you want to decide, one, do you want to be in it, and two, if you do want to be in it, how are you going to get into it? Are you going to get there organically by retooling the workforce and the business units you have, or more commonly, are you going to go out and buy somebody who brings in the workforce that you think you're going to need? Most instances, you go with the latter. You go out and find somebody who's good at it, and you go buy that workforce. So how do you make those determinations? Well, you're looking for the demand function from government, from your customer base. What demands do they have? And once you've settled on that and you've settled on getting into a marketplace, then you create your own demand function. And your demand function there is what's the workforce you need and who do you need? So in general, in industry, it's more likely that you've got the second order demand function. You're answering a demand because you're answering a demand, and that means you have to go out to the people that provide you with the workforce you're going to need, people having the skills that are going to be required. I've been talking to the people out here in the hallway over the last couple of days, the St. Leo, the Thomas Edison University, and others, and it is important for them to understand the command function and the demand function. How do they get that? They get it because the industry understands what they want, and to understand what they want, they've got to understand what the government thinks it wants and what it needs. And despite what you might think, that is not always the easiest thing to understand and interpret. So that would be kind of my introduction to what I hope our panel will be talking about in greater detail. Let me introduce them. Going to my right, Rear Admiral Bill Leigher, retired Rear Admiral of the United States Navy, where he worked in DoD cyber warfare programs, where he's now with Raytheon, as we called in the industry. Raytheon's Big Red, Northrop Grumman is Big Blue, GD is Bigger Big Blue, Lockheed Martin is Bigger Big, and Boeing is Bigger Biggest. So that's kind of the pecking order that you get out there in the defense industry. Bill's a lot of experience over many years in cyber warfare and dealing with that. I assume you had something to do with 10th Fleet at one time, the Navy component of cyber warfare. Next to him, we have retired Major General Jennifer Napper. Jennifer is Vice President at DXC Technology, also has a lot of experience in cyber, DoD Cyber Command, U.S. Army Network Enterprise Technology Command. And she's done an awful lot of work in standardized info assurance. So Jennifer, welcome to the panel. Glad to have you here. Off to her right, Dr. Matthew McFadden. Dr. McFadden is with CSRA Cyber Services Area Director with the Digital Consulting Group, providing expertise and thought leadership to their cybersecurity qualification efforts. And down at the end, Mr. Joel Esler. I noted that Joel was at one point in time an Army veteran, or is an Army veteran, who had service as a multi-channel transmission supervisor for the Department of the Army. I asked him if that meant that he one time supervised a rat rig, and he said that was way before his time, which just showed how old I am. So I appreciate all of you.
Shows how old I am, I think.
I appreciate all of you here and all your participations. Bill, I'd like to turn the chair over to you.
Thanks, Tom. So, having, had a chance from up here, and I watched the game and seeing really what the problem was, I think what I'm going to go do is seed a capstone engineering project for the midshipmen to put LiDAR on the helmets of all the mids so they can locate the Black Knights as they're playing, and that maybe, that changes it from a technology perspective. I don't know. Clearly something has to change.
We're fine with it. We're good.
Or, yeah. One of the podcasts that I keep in my library is a address by Steve Jobs to a Stanford graduating class, and the point there he makes the perspective is that you can only figure things out by having the chance to look back and see where the dots are and then connect them. And so my remarks this morning really come from 8 years ago this week, getting ready to commission 10th Fleet, followed by a tour as a resource sponsor, and now being really excited by the activity that I see with a cyber mission force that is created, but perhaps not ready and where that needs to go. So with those perspectives, I'll start in really giving some observations on what we were asked to do and talk about talent development, talent acquisition in industry. And the first thing that I would tell you, in industry, it's no different than I looked at it in the Navy. Fundamentally, people are hard. They have families, they have aspirations, they have career goals, and when you hire an individual on the industry side, it's maybe a little bit easier than your detailer sending you to your next duty station, but all of those same things factor in. So you have to just say, I'm dealing with the people, and then on top of that, I think there's probably a lot of subterfuge and preconceptions about how industry treats individuals and what we do. But Tom, really kind of summarized it really well. We respond to a customer demand that's been put on the street, and it really comes down to you've asked us to do a very particular job. You've identified key functions within that. You've identified key skills that you need, and we go hire them. And then the problem really comes back to from my last job, which was building the Navy POM for cyber intelligence communications. In an era of sequestration, there's really no growth here. So what are we really doing in most government service contracts for cyber right now? We're recharacterizing a contract, and the people are following that recharacterization of the money because there's no real growth. So it's really a hard problem. And so the things that you might hear about, industry trying to, poach someone from another company, looking, through the fence on a base, probably aren't held out in the way that the process really works. We're responding to a demand signal that happens. There aren't a lot of good statistics on what happens in attrition on the industry side. In general, I think the turnover of any of the big defense companies for our engineers is about 5%. I'm not sure that those are valid for cyber when the industry says that unemployment for cyber engineers and cyber experts that are working in the government sector, that unemployment rate is 0%, so there's always a demand signal there. And so what I would tell you from my observation at Raytheon, when people leave, it's this recharacterization of a contract that the customer liked an individual, and they're following where that contract is because their skill is there and needed in a particular work environment. And the second reason for attrition is there's a lot of entrepreneurship around the information technology, information age sectors, and you find an awful lot of individuals forming their own companies and going off to say, I can do this a little bit better. So it really, you have the nexus of those three things to work with. You got people's desires and wants, and where the job market really is, what the skills that are demanded in a service-based industry to be able to do that. The second observation is that while technology changes pretty quickly, and I think we all factored this, the work roles have changed a lot less dramatically than you might expect. And I think that's going to change very, very quickly in the defense sector because of the cyber mission force that is going to put a bigger premium on training, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine to specific skills around a piece of equipment, and less to, I'm going to hire you to do analytical work, I'm going to hire you to do some function as an outsourced thing. And that dynamic will change things. But in general, as Tom did mention, whether it's the government or the commercial sector, we're providing a service from an industry point of view. And I think, around the cyber for the intelligence community, cyber for system administrators and outsourcing networks, you really have come accustomed to, I'm going to demand that as a service. And what I can see happening because of a demand signal to have a military-ready force, it is going to change things. And as an example, it will become soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who are going to be responsible for warfighting actions in a battlefield environment, whether that's a land environment, an air environment, or a maritime environment, where you're operating equipment that does the job rather than outsourcing. None of the services are going to deploy with contractors in a way that we're depending on those individuals who are hired to do the basic warfighting skills. And I think that's where cyber is about to change in a very, very dramatic way. I think that leads, around the cyber mission for us to have perhaps a more holistic approach. And a lot of the discussion in the last couple of days have been about the ability for that workforce to be mobile, to perhaps exchange within government roles to industry roles, and be able to learn that way. But I also think we need to, within the cyber mission force, be a lot more able to flex between a DCO role and an OCO role, and share those skills. And what I see as I continue to go about and talk with leaders in the various teams, whether it's a combat mission team or a cyber protection team, is there's still a real stratification between how the individuals on those teams talk about their work skills. The combat mission teams, I think, are still very closely aligned to how we started in using cyber as a way to collect intelligence, and I think in all of the services, the CPTs are still pretty much aligned and think of themselves where they came from in a signal or communications environment. And I think that's a barrier that we've got to figure out how to overcome, because we don't think about warfighting that way in any other domain that we do. You have a team. I don't think that I'm going to go put a defensive ship to sea or an offensive ship to sea. I'm going to put a ship to sea. And that is really, I think, how the trajectory of the cyber mission force will start to take. And that creates a demand signal, I think, for different skills and different equipment as you go through there. The other piece of this is how do you really change to get both this balanced innovation and the ability to scale these ideas that are coming out of organizations like DOIX, using other kinds of procurement authorities like OTAs, to be able to come up with innovative ideas that can be prototyped very quickly. But it's not the prototyping that I think the force is going to have. It is going to be, how do you really scale that across an army that's 500,000 sailors strong, a navy that's 350,000 sailors strong, an air force that's 350,000 airmen strong. And that's really the challenge, to be able to get that innovation at a scale that it really makes sense in a way that protects our warfighting system if you're on the DCO side of that, or gives combatant commanders more options if you're on the offensive side of that. And one of the things that was said yesterday, and it was Alan Pollar's SANS presentation yesterday, that I think is part of the key to this in looking at this. And you know, my words perhaps more than his, but what that says that our cyber workforce is like every other workforce. There are a bunch of rock stars out there. We all knew who they were in our units. We depended on them. They were the ones who were going to get any problem fixed for you. And there were, and I love the Brits' words, you know, from having done a tour in the UK, there are others that are acceptable. They come to work, they do their job, they've got the right skill, and I've trained them to what I expected them to be able to do. They're acceptable. More soldiers, more sailors fall into acceptable in what they do than rock stars, and I think that's true whether you're talking about an air traffic controller or a cyber operator. I think it's true whether you're talking about a sonarman. So we have a good way of training that to those kind of capabilities, and I think there's a very powerful method there. But it's also got to be with a change in technology that goes with that, and an assumption that we have to stop and think about what our assumptions are and how we operate and look at that. Now, I think there's a trajectory that's happened in every warfare area. Air power is the one we had an opportunity to look at, but air power started with grenades being dropped out of an open cockpit, and today air power is probably better demonstrated with weapons like Tomahawks and UAVs. There's a lot of automation that went in all the learning that we did over a century of air power, and I think cyber is going to follow that automation, and what we will start to see is a lot more technology that has been shrunk wrapped into a black box, for lack of a better description right now, where you have the automation, because with our acceptable workforce, the ability to train those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to the standards of what technology is follows a DoD equipping and manning model, and I see no reason why cyber shouldn't emulate that in the long run. And I think that's true whether we're talking about OCO or DCO. And the last thing is, it really comes back to the training. What's that training have to look like? We have to come back with training that goes in the same way that we think about how the Army uses National Training Center, how the Navy uses Fallon, and how the Air Force uses Nellis. A realistic training environment where I can go fight the way that I'm going to fight in cyberspace. And I think the things that are online now with you know, improvements to the national training, the National Cyber Range with PCTE are the beginning of that, and it puts it all together into finally an ecosystem that we'll have. I probably used a little bit more than my 7 minutes, but.
All right, thank you very much, Bill. General Knapper?
So good afternoon. Thank you to the Cyber Center and, of course, to FCA for hosting this event. They're always exciting when you can get the government and the academia and industry together. So my comments will be kind of shorter in scope because I've only got 4 years in industry, and I'm going to try and focus on what I've observed in 4 years. I've now worked for 1 defense contractor and 2 global IT companies, and so I'm going to speak more from the global IT company perspective probably than the defense contractor. As part of my research, so I'd have some more relevant numbers, I went online in the living room with my feet put up nowadays as opposed to in a cold office, but looked up what kind of jobs have been posted in the last 30 days having to do with cybersecurity. And I went to 4 or 5 different well-known places where they post those kinds of jobs. On average, there's 15 to 20,000. Now, there's obviously a lot of overlap between them, so don't draw numbers in an additive fashion, but 15 to 20,000 jobs posted under the cybersecurity category in the last 30 days. So that doesn't mean much. So you scroll down it, and you have things like cybersecurity policy, analyst, engineer, 10 or 12 other categories. So that was just in cybersecurity. I didn't go look up network security, information security, cyber operations, communications, or any of those areas which probably have overlap to the same same skill sets that we're talking about the challenge in educating and recruiting and retaining today. What that means to me is we have a mismatch today between the labor categories that come out in RFPs and the actual job skills and job descriptions that are out in the real world. And so, as Bill was saying, when you start trying to match up what the government really wants, it's very confusing to those of us trying to fill those requirements. So my first takeaway point for you is we need a common lexicon about what you really want or need in your government positions so that we can actually fill those. The skills, the people, they're probably out there. They probably don't know that they are out there because the way things are written. Several times over the last 4 years, we've seen draft RFPs come out of agencies that's exactly the same as the one from 5 years earlier. And I would contend that I don't think there's much going on in the cyber area where the same skill sets are required 5 years later. So I just ask you to kind of look at that labor category, job description, and think about it, and then look at, do we have a common lexicon that we can all come to agreement on so that we can understand what skills you're really looking for. I know there's some great folks in DC and federal agencies working on that, and we'll see them in about 10 years. So if y'all can help with that, that would help a lot. The second one would be the discussion we had over this morning in group number 3 about standards and certifications in education, and I noticed it was actually in all 3 groups. All 3 groups pulled that thread. The military services take high school graduates. They spend anywhere from 3 to 9 months, and they train them with their basic acceptable skill set. Less than a year, they develop cyber warriors. We see RFPs saying to do basic cybersecurity skill level, lowest level, you have to have a bachelor's degree, 10 years of experience, and oh, by the way, it's an LPTA, so you're not going to pay them more than $40,000. There's a significant mismatch between those 2 expectations and ability for industry to deliver to you what I think you really need. So I'd ask you to think, what do you really need in your certifications? Can the tech schools and the elevations and the scales that the last panel was just talking about actually help you meet your requirements? Can you bring them in with a certification, and as they work through and get that job experience, help them get their associates, help them get their bachelors, and help them grow up and see a real career field there? So I'd just like to point that out, that there's a balance there, and because you put something like a bachelor's degree and 10 years experience, the government is paying significantly more than they need to for the basic skill level that you're asking for. So it's twofold there. The third thing I would tell you is in industry, we don't just work for the government. This is a global IT company like Cisco and many others. And so we have to look at across the board those same kind of skill sets being used, whether we're working for a bank or working for the Army or working in an intel community. And then what are the differences? And so I just ask you to kind of think about that when you start looking at that common lexicon. And then the last part, Bill kind of touched on, and Tom certainly hit on, the open communications about what your real requirements are start not the day the RFP's dropped, but in forums like this, and in open dialogue, in office calls where you actually hear from Bill and I how things are changing in industry so that you can take a look at what you really want or need, and then, you know, getting the hard work together and writing it down on the piece of paper. The guys that are changing jobs a lot, you hear that there's hard to hire places like DC. I learned in the last year there's hard to hire places everywhere in this country right now. I don't care if you're in Omaha or in Louisville, Kentucky, or Huntsville, Alabama. It is hard to find the right skill sets to hire right now because the demand is so great on everything except the federal government. You know what I'm saying? You had a no growth and sequestration. The rest of the world moved on, and they're hiring like crazy. So just kudos to those who are here, opening the dialogue, sharing the information, and thanks for the time, Tom.
Well, thank you very much. Wonderful comments, and I think everyone should focus on what she mentioned about trying to get the right interpretation for the skill sets required for the job that you really want done, because making that match is not always as easy as it might seem. Next we have Dr. McFadden. I'd like to point out he's about ready to finish his second doctorate, he said. So we were trying to figure out an acronym for that. So I noticed, Jennifer is with, of course, DXC, and I think when you refer to Dr. McFadden, we'll just call him D2. Okay.
I guess I have to finish mine. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for the invite. We're excited to kind of be a part of the CERTS conference. Cyber education and training is very passionate for CSRA in general. And we have a very kind of unique position. So if you're not familiar with CSRA, we're actually the spinoff of CSC and solely dedicated to public sector. Now, I was laughing because General Napper here is with DXC, which CSC became DXC. So I guess I used to work in that circle. But CSRA is solely dedicated to public work. We have about 20,000 folks. We operate globally, but mostly focused on DoD, Intel, and civilian type environments. So we have a lot of very unique cyber type work that we do, but with that, we also manage a lot of essentially the enterprises and enterprise IT and just a whole lot of IT environments out there. So not only are we helping kind of improve the various cyber missions, but also working to improve the security posture of a lot of our environments. So kind of while I say that is, so from a CSRA perspective, in order to kind of help move us towards kind of meeting that demand, we kind of started to map what we call a taxonomy to respond. Because cyber is a very, very large domain. One soldier, airman, can't solve the world in cyber. So you have to really kind of figure out where your manpower is allocated to, is part of those cyber teams. So we kind of saw what was happening down here in Augusta and Fort Gordon, and we kind of launched our own Cyber Center of Excellence. A little bit a different model, but I think one of the challenges is we really want to ensure that our workforce has access to a lot of the innovations out there in industry. And generally we operate as a integrator where we don't have our own products per se, but we generally take the specialized cyber solutions and we put them together to something that can scale to hundreds and thousands of users. So to kind of put it in perspective, I kind of look at it as 5 key areas that you probably need to consider when it comes to cyber workforce and training. And the other tidbit I will give you is through CSRA we actually have had the Defense Cyber Investigations Training Academy program for the last 18 years, or DCITA. And I spent a good 10 years there as the lead engineer, and an instructor. Everything from teaching reverse engineering, network intrusion, to building what was our cyber range way back before we really thought about cybersecurity. So now we're training probably about 30,000 DoD personnel annually just through DCITA operating that contract. And we've also begun to launch our own cyber institute to help meet that demand. But to go back to those kind of 5 things is, there's definitely the demand. There's not a constant supply. I think one of the things that we're saying is, we can't hire all unicorns, right? We have to have some of the acceptable folks. But you have to organize your cyber team to essentially kind of figure out where your risks are. There is a difference between training and education. It's kind of the thinking versus doing. The hands-on practical application of cyber training is really key. It's one thing to read about it. It's another thing to get exposed to an environment where an attack hasn't occurred. What do you do? So I think it needs to kind of be event-driven. You have to teach those critical thinking skills. Problem solving is probably the most important thing when it comes to preparing those individuals for the future. I think there's components for individual training, but I think the industry as a whole needs to focus more on the team-based training, because one individual can't do it all. The other thing that I would say is manpower is and resourcing it is kind of key. I think a lot of times you have the mission and you kind of have like the enterprise IT folks, but I don't think we do a good job of understanding the amount of cybersecurity professionals that you need to, manage the cybersecurity posture of an environment. So realistically, if you have one person, how many workloads can they effectively, look at? How many systems? And I think part of that also is kind of working into the types of tools and that you have available to your team. So that's kind of my third thing is tools. Every day you read about a new SIM tool or threat intelligence tool or a new feature, but I think from a government and an industry perspective, kind of why we've kind of formed our Center of Excellence is we got to get those tools and capabilities out to our cyber professionals. And a lot of times when their day-to-day exposure to the networks, they might not have the time to actually kind of to really learn that new product. So one of the things that we kind of do internally is we have hackathons where we select a few of the kind of key leaders in a certain area in cyber and bring those vendors in and just walk them through kind of using the product through those kind of various problem sets. And it's a really, really good way for them to kind of take that back to their customer or whatever they're working on. The fourth thing I would look at is we have to be agile. The technology landscape is constantly changing. I mean, it's, every year, 2 years, there's something completely new. I mean, you probably all understand how cloud has taken off within DoD. From our perspective, we do a lot of integrations for AWS, Azure. We also recently won the MilCloud contract where we're building out a DoD private cloud. And with cloud computing, I mean, there's a lot of processes and policies that I think a lot of the teams are trying to figure out. But from a cyber perspective, your threat landscape is changing. So the traditional tools that you're used to using may not work in the perimeter now because the perimeter is not as defined. So the DoD has come out with aligning the folks to a cybersecurity service provider. They've defined like a secure cloud computing architecture. And one of the things that we're trying to do is kind of figure out what's the best structure to get some of those products as part of that kind of security architecture that we can kind of get out and reuse amongst our programs. And then the last piece I think is the threat landscape, right? Every week we read about a brand new threat. I mean, Meltdown, Spectre, WannaCry. We need to have processes in place to really kind of take those threats and kind of develop lessons learned to inject those into our cyber professionals. I think that's really key. And kind of as we move into the future, I think I really see there's a very big drive in AI and machine learning, and we're kind of working with a lot of our cyber partners to kind of drive how that is incorporated into the security posture. Obviously, the benefit of that is if we can use AI and machine learning to find and detect and deter threats, that requires less manual resources from the workforce. So it's kind of the do more with less mentality. So that's all I got.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. I think I neglected when I mentioned and introduced Joel that my excitement over him being a former multi-channel transmission specialist. I neglected to mention that he's currently Threat Intelligence Team Lead for Cisco Talos Security Intelligence and Research Group, which means that he has a wide range of vision on exactly the demands for the cyber workforce and the demands for the functions that need to be performed. Joel?
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. Augusta, Georgia has a special place in my heart. I think it does for a lot of us. I did my AIT here. I was stationed here. I got out of the military here. I was in 67 Single Battalion. Mm-hmm. And during the latter half of my career here, I actually had an injured my back, so couldn't put up antennas anymore, couldn't go to the field anymore. wound up being an operations sergeant, wound up with, hey, we need somebody to come over to this group that we have that we're just standing up, and it's called the Regional Computer Emergency Response Team. We didn't know what that was at the time. And so I worked for, went over there, and I was assigned to, or detached to a group called Leigher, if you guys remember Leigher, which became First I.O. Command. Yeah. So I was one of the original members of RCERT South here on Fort Gordon, and I valued my time here, and I love it here. I lived here for a bunch of years. And then I was hired by a little company called SourceFire. And SourceFire ceased to become a small company, and we got bought. We were purchased about 4 years ago by Cisco. So that's kind of how I wound up here. It's true, I'm one of the managers of the Talos group, and for those of you that have ever heard of the Talos group within the last 3 or 4 years, it's the threat intelligence arm of Cisco. We make all of the content that ships to all of the Cisco security products, which means that we have a motley crew of individuals, people that can write detection, people that can reverse engineer, people that write exploits, people that find vulnerabilities within software, report those to vendors, things like that. We have graphic designers, we have web programmers, we have everything that you can imagine within the Talos group. And so I say that to say that during the last 20 years, I've kind of been able to have a lot of different industry experience, and it's been very beneficial for me. I look across the table here, and everybody's got these notes. These are my notes of what I was going to say. And the reason I wrote these notes down is because these are the buzz phrases that I heard over the past 48 hours, or the phrases. Let's put that, not buzz phrases. The first thing that I wrote down was critical thinking. Okay, everybody's critical thinking, critical thinking, critical thinking. And to what you were saying, Bill, is that we train people to be acceptable, right? We have everybody to have an even keel of an acceptable level of knowledge. Everybody has these base skills, right, or the 1.0 of an MOS, right? And that's fine. But you put me in a room with 50 of those 1.0s, and I will find the one person that is your expert. And I don't know how to describe how to do that. I think there's ways. Obviously, we can teach people about IDS. We can teach people about antivirus and security and network and routing and switch, et cetera, et cetera. We can teach people those skills, the technical skills that they need to know. But how do you find the person? This is where I spend a lot of my time, because I run the education group within Talos, but this is where I spend a lot of my time thinking, is how do I identify those people that I would hire at Cisco within those 50 people? And those are your exceptionals. How do you identify those? And that's something that I think more than anything that we've gotten right within the Talos group at Cisco is hiring. That's the one thing I think we've nailed. And I'm very proud of that. But it's, I was talking to somebody earlier or yesterday, and I was like, man, I would love to come down here to Fort Gordon, to the school, and walk into these rooms and sit there and listen for a week. I'd love to do that. And I would sit there and I would say, and I would look for those candidates. And I would point them out and I'd say, that's the person. That's the guy that's going to win, right? And I don't know, I think it's just my experience over time that's it's the gut feeling that you get. And it's funny because I was talking to one of our Cisco guys that's here, and I was standing at the booth, and he's like, how do you do that? I'm like, I have absolutely no idea. I can see him walk past, and I know which ones, and somebody about 10 minutes later, right, just walked past, and I said, her. She's one of those. And he was like, I actually know her, and you're right. And so it was kind of interesting. The second thing I wrote down was measurement and quantifiable. You can't, and this is going to make people violently angry at me, you can't measure awesome. You can't quantify awesome. It's impossible to do that. You can grade people, and you can say, yes, you meet the minimum requirements. But to look for the people that are going to go past those minimum requirements and be the phenomenal people that you need on that wall, that you want on that wall, right? You want those people that you want on that wall. You can't grade that. You can't find that. It's inherent. It becomes apparent when you look at those people and they just, you guys know who I'm talking about. You've all dealt with them, right? You walk into any job and you can find that person. It's like that's the guy. He's our expert in blah, blah, blah. Okay. He's our expert in everything. That's the guy, right? And it's, how do you find that? And that's where I spend a lot of my time. The last thing that I wrote down, and this has to do with what you were saying, is, I can't call you Jennifer. I can't do that. Is certifications and degrees. And I was telling this to somebody earlier yesterday as well, is if I looked at the resumes that come in to the Cisco Talos group, and I looked at certifications and degrees, and that's all I went off of, I would ignore the best people we have. Furthermore, if I said, you must have a degree to work here, nope, you're dismissing your best candidates right off the bat. Then the third part that I would say is that, you know, if you're coming, and I'm not downplaying degrees, Doctor number 2, is I'm not downplaying that. I'm saying that you're going to miss some of your best candidates. And to go back to what you were saying about a lexicon, some of the best people I have hired and they come to me and I get their resume, has absolutely nothing cyber on it at all. Our best hires are doctors in physics. Would you look at somebody with a physics degree that has never worked in cyber in their entire world, and you're like, oh, I need somebody to be a cybersecurity professional. Oh, here's this guy with his physics degree. Right? No, don't do that. Don't do that. I think that's my 2 cents is you're throwing away your best candidates by doing that. So I think that's where I'm at, and I think I would really like to encourage discussion is what I would like to do, but you know.
Thank you very much, Joel. The discussion down there, you reminded me of something I had at General Dynamics once. We were going to hire a person. We had 2 candidates. I wanted one. My boss wanted the other. We hired the one my boss wanted. That one left after about a year. The one I wanted is now Senior Vice President at Northrop Grumman, and my boss is now CEO of General Dynamics. So, you know, you just never know how these things are going to work out. You've got to have an open mind about it, and I think that's
you got to have an open mind, and you got to go with your gut. I learned that the hard way a couple times hiring.
You got to go with your gut. But I think the consensus you heard across the panel, for those of you out here, is that, you know, industry basically, you know, unlike the military in particular, we hire people, we don't grow people. We have to go out and look for them. We don't have a taxonomy like basic course, advanced course, command and staff college. You've got to go out there and find the right person for the right job. And your probability of doing that and doing that well is magnificently enhanced if you know what the right job actually is. And so there's where the communications part comes in. That's where the value of AFCEA and conferences such as this. So we've got some time left for questions and answers, and we'll be more than happy to entertain those.
Thank you. First question. Can the panel please discuss how the NIST NICE framework may address the need for common lexicon?
So I'll take it first since I've kind of made this comment about it. So there are government agencies that are going to do a really good job of getting consensus across all the inputs from everybody like NIST and NICE, and by the time they publish it, it'll be like that college degree you started that by the time you graduated was no longer something useful in the workplace. So because the process there is so laborious, it is not, from my perspective, going to be agile enough to keep up. Now, if they change it and they make an agile a way to make those changes as the industry changes and as the needs change, then I think it would be useful. Bill?
I guess you know, I would echo something that Jennifer said during her comments. It's around the whole ecosystem of jobs that are really in this federal environment, and while you are using that framework to identify the government workload roles, are you applying that framework to the contract work roles that need to go with that? And that's a place that I think it could help. I think from the discussion yesterday in the panel it's really some valuable work, but it needs to be applied universally, not just for the people who are GS employees or perhaps a very specific service support. It's got to be everything.
I also believe that they're a little generic, right? I mean, they're bland, they're whitewashed, they have buzzwords in them, and I think what you're going to look for is when you're putting out a job posting, you want to be specific about what you want, and you want to use the actual phrases that you want them to do. If you want someone to know how to do event review in an IPS, put that in the job description.
Joel said something in his remarks that I couldn't agree with more, and I'll give you a sense of a kind of a hiring event for the kind of guys that you hire and some of the vulnerability research that we do. You're identified through a networking event. What's a networking event? It's probably a public capture the flag thing that hackers get together on a weekend someplace and do, and you say, hey, that guy was pretty good. Let's kind of target them as a future employee. You get invited to an event at a conference room in a hotel called the Marriott in Augusta, Georgia, or Des Moines, or Sioux City, or go pick a place. It's really not that. If you do okay during that weekend, you get a business card. The business card has a problem on it. It's got a problem that's based in computer science, computer engineering, electrical engineering. If you solve the problem, you get an email address to send your resume to. That is who would say that's a traditional hiring process for any job? But to find the kind of guys that Joel needs in his team, or the high-end vulnerability researchers that we would do for the work that we do for some government customers, you are not looking for a typical work role.
We have a T-shirt that on the back is all. It's actually an exploit. We do this every year. When we go to Black Hat, Black Hat DEF CON is a big industry conference that we go to. But when we go to Black Hat or DEF CON every year, we make a different T-shirt every year, and it's generally a vulnerability in a piece of software. But at the end of it, at the end of the exploit that's on the back of the shirt, is a link to our job site. So if you actually manage to decode it, those are the people I want to hire.
Very non-standard employment technique, I must say. So.
We have time for one more question. How well do you in industry understand the key problems and priorities for the military and cyber, given the rapid change in threats and technology they face?
General Napper, I think it might be a good one for you to start with.
Yeah. So I think you heard throughout the last day and a half that it's a constantly changing environment, and therefore they're constantly changing the definitions and their learning. I think General Morrison said it best at the lunch session. They're now looking at the nexus between, go figure, cyber, electronic warfare, and signal. And so that the fact that they're learning as well, and how well they begin to communicate out what they're learning, will help us refine what we know and understand.
I would say that personally I spend not as much time that I did when I was 10th Fleet in a position of actually, being responsible for the sailors doing this, but a lot more time that I did when I was in the Pentagon talking to the individuals who are in CPTs and CMTs, understanding what their gaps are, because I can't be, effective in knitting together the pieces of technology and intellectual property that we have in the company to give a solution that's going to work. And so I spend an incredible amount of time doing this. It's one, it keeps me in contact with a lot of patriots that I think give their all for the country every day and trying to make this mission area better. But it's the only way that I can really do my job.
And before we wrap, I have to say I had lunch with a fine gentleman from DAU, and he was he was very honest about his frustration on getting folks to understand across the acquisition community and across the requirements community what cybersecurity and cyber is. And I just kind of cut it simple to him. When you're running 100 miles an hour, you don't notice the buildings next to you, okay? And you get kind of focused on the problems that you're trying to solve. So it does take a community like this to help the government see the things that they're running past, because they are working so hard and so focused on the problem sets they've been given, they might be missing some very critical pieces that have also got to be running in parallel. So I just open that up a little bit. It makes it harder for the government to see. As an old retiree now, you can go back and look and see all the things I will put in the eye. I don't know about you. I missed while running 100 miles an hour. So just let us help them see what they're not seeing.
I just add one thing to that. A lot of the major companies still, to this day, which is why I'd say companies like the ones that Jennifer, Matthew, and Joel represent, still have rather traditional hiring processes that are kind of built upon the past experiences. Just to pick an example, Northrop Grumman built its B-2 team over probably a decade, finding the right engineers, finding the people who were looking into stealth technology, people who were finding out how you could apply those materials to an airframe. So if you went back 1 year and met with the people there, and you went back 3 years later, you would meet the same people who had moved up 2 or 3 notches. That model does not apply very well to what we're dealing with in terms of cyber, which goes back to the comment that I made early on, why we have to have a higher degree of communications and understanding between the providers who are trying to provide the service that's requested. But in order to do that, they've got to understand exactly what the thought process and what the requirement demands is on the other side. And I think for the 3 of us up here to my right who have been on both sides of the mirror, that's probably a bit more obvious than it was to us in our previous lives. But I hope that was all very helpful. So thank you all for coming out. I thank the panel for all the insights and ideas that they put out, and the observations, and the importance of this particular topic of cyber, because I think we all recognize how central it is to what we're dealing with now. Bob?
Tom, good job. Let's give him a hand. Great panel. A great panel, and Jennifer, thanks for really putting a point on it, that we're trying to offer this opportunity to see those other insights as we go 100 miles an hour pursuing our mission. And by the way, Joel, I can call General Knepper Jennifer only because I'm a general officer. I can't call a sergeant major by their first name. I cannot do it. I absolutely cannot do it. I have such great respect for them, as we do for... It won't happen. Well, listen, we have offered an industry perspective. I'd like to offer on behalf of this panel, AFCEA will make a donation to Fisher House. Thank you so much for being here with us, and I offer a chance to leave the stage, and I'm going to bring the panel right up, the next one up. We're going to give you a 5-minute stretch break. We're going to have the next panel in place so we finish on time. You can catch those planes, make that link. Thank you very much again.